Welcome back, everyone, as we take a look at the second half of the video, Know Your Ally, Britain, which was a film that was produced by the United States government during the Second World War to help Americans, particularly American soldiers, understand who it was that we were fighting alongside and who it was whose country we were going to be hosted by for many of these troops as they prepared for the invasion of the mainland of Europe. But if you haven't seen the first half of my reaction to that series, or to that video, the link is down in the description, as well as the link to the original video from the National Archives, so you can watch it without my commentary. I've had a lot of questions about the different football jerseys that I wear, and I'm wearing some English ones for this, since we're taking a look at Britain. Come from a variety of sources. One of them is the teams that I support, and I tend to try to pick a team in every major league of football, or soccer as we call it in the States, to support. So my home team here in the United States is Columbus Crew, defending MLS Cup champs. They're the closest MLS team to where I live, about 2.5 hours away. In England, the team that I mainly support is West Bromwich Albion, and I did a video over on VTH Extra talking about why I chose West Brom as my team. The link is in the description to VTH Extra if you want to check that out. I also support a team in Scotland, which is Rangers, because my family lived in Govan, which is where Rangers are, and my great-great-grandfather owned a pub in Govan, or in Glasgow, that it's still there to this day, and it's a Rangers pub, so I kind of went with them for those reasons. But there's other teams, Hoffenheim in Germany. I like Wrexham, just because of the whole story. I think it's fascinating. But a lot of people send me shirts as well, and the one that I wore yesterday was one that was sent to me. It was actually someone who came to our meetup, or was going to come to our meetup in London that we did when I was there earlier this year, but he couldn't make it, and so he mailed me the Newcastle jersey instead. This Exeter City one came from one of the guys over at the channel Decades, and this is the team that he supports. I also have a Bolton Wanderers jersey that they sent me, so a lot of different ways that I get the jerseys, and so you'll see those turn up every so often when I'm playing, or when I'm doing something related to one of those places, or just because it happens to be what I'm wearing that day. But all of that is just to give you a little background and help you to understand how it is that I end up wearing so many different jerseys. And if you're interested in sending me one, send me a message and I'll let you know how you can get it to me. So there's only a few that I won't wear. I'm looking at you, Wolverhampton, Celtic. I think those are probably about the only two that I absolutely under no circumstances would wear. So anything else is fair game. All right, let's dive into this video.
But this gentleman never bothered about the truth. And when John Britain started carrying the war to Germany, he tried a new line.
The warmonger Churchill only wages this war against the German people to save the British Empire.
All right, let's take a look at that one.
So, isn't it interesting, in light of what we just covered a while back with Daryl Cooper spouting many of these same claims that the warmonger Churchill only fought the war for XYZ? Notice where the source of a lot of those arguments comes from. It goes right back to German propaganda from during the war.
Here's the British Empire. And here's where the Germans were headed when Britain declared war. Does that look like trying to save the empire? Tackling Germany when it was headed into Poland and toward Russia? The one direction in which there were no British possessions? After Poland fell, Hitler hinted at peace with the British. This was the perfect chance to save the empire.
Yep.
But it wasn't saving the empire that the British were thinking about.
The position of His Majesty's government in respect of any peace offer by Hitler. We are not, in any circumstances, prepared to negotiate with him at any time on any subject.
And after Britain had been on the losing end, month after month, it had another chance to save the empire. Even now, Hitler thought John Britain would make a deal. We heard the British answer.
So Hess is the deputy Führer at that time, and he goes on this kind of crazy mission where he jumps in a fighter plane and flies it to Scotland and ends up bailing out of the plane with a parachute, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison after that. It was this desire to negotiate, but it seems as though he kind of did it on his own without the knowledge of the German government. There's no way to know for sure, but it seems that's the case. But it doesn't make sense, because if the idea was to save the empire, there were plenty of opportunities for the British government, even before Churchill came to power in May of 1940, to negotiate and put an end to it.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
I was about to say, I think that's a speech being given in Congress in Washington, D.C., because you could see ABC, CBS, NBC, all of those broadcasting microphones there. This is a joint session of Congress, and this is, of course, Churchill understanding once again the importance of an ally in the United States.
And let's take a look at this British Empire. The freedom we fought for in 1776, Britain has since freely given to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. These are independent nations with their own parliaments, their own laws, even their own money systems, their own tariffs, which often work to Britain's disadvantage.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they do have the monarch as head of state, and so King George VI was the head of state for those places as well, but they're, for all intents and purposes, independent nations.
On armies and navies. Britain couldn't even take them into war if she wanted to. That's a problem they settled for themselves. Each one of the British Commonwealth of Nations declared war on Germany of its own free will.
Of course, no one ever talks about the British Empire today without mentioning India.
That's a fair point.
And men of goodwill in Britain as well as other countries have been outspoken in their demands for Indian freedom.
I give a lot of credit to this, because they're not just making this a rosy, the British are perfect in every way and we should support them picture. You know, they're acknowledging, hey, they've still got a problem here that they've got to address in how they're handling India.
For no man who believes in democracy can support foreign rule of any people. But there are things that many of us do not know about India. For instance, that India pays no taxes to Britain, either directly or indirectly. That the Indians fix their own tariff laws, frequently to Britain's disadvantage. That of the Viceroy's Executive Council, 11 of the 15 members are Indians. And in the courts, 10 of every 11 judges. Furthermore, that no Indian is ever conscripted for service in the Army and Navy. It was voluntary enlistment that raised the Indian Army from 170,000 at the outbreak of war to 1.25 million today. And on the subject of India, listen to the words of Field Marshal Jan Christian Smuts. He fought against the British 40 years ago, was defeated in his fight, and still became the leader of one of the British Commonwealths of Nations, Prime Minister of South Africa.
India, if she will, can be free in the same way and by the same means as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are today free sovereign states. Their peoples worked out a constitution for themselves. The same course is open to India if the peoples of India will agree about the terms of a free constitution. Freedom isn't a thing that can be imposed from without. It can only be created from within.
That's some really interesting and prophetic advice, because think about how many times in the 20th century nations would attempt to impose freedom on foreign powers. And we see how often it doesn't work, trying to what we call nation build, instead of allowing it to rise from within those places. That's not to say that there weren't things that the British were doing very, very wrong in their handling of India. And I'm not an expert on those things to be able to speak to it. Many of you are, and you can speak to those things far better than I can. So we can acknowledge that this should not gloss over the fact that, you know, it does. I said it a few minutes ago that I was glad they were covering this, but at the same time, it does have a little bit of a hint of, hey, India could have it if they would just do something about it. You know, it's more complicated than that.
The Indians have a responsibility to reconcile the differences that exist in the vast Indian population, with its 100 different languages, its dozens of different religions. And on March the 11th, 1942, the British government placed itself on record and promised full self-government to India if India will work out a constitution that will satisfy its people after the war is over. But during this war, military leaders agree Allied troops are needed in India as an effective bloc by the democratic world to keep the Nazis and Japs from uniting. Further,
Hope I don't get demonetized. That term used for the Japanese that was super common is considered a slur, and I actually had one of my recent videos on my gaming channel for Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts when I was fighting against the Japanese. I referred to them that way, and it got my video demonetized.
India provides the bases for United Nations bombers to get at the Japs in Burma. In other parts of the empire, too, democracy stands on guard. If it wasn't for the British at Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Suez, Alexandria, and they're hanging on to them regardless of the cost, and their drive across Libya to Tripoli, there would have been no American landing in North Africa.
So it's interesting. So this has obviously been made after the war has begun. So Operation Torch, you have George S. Patton among those who are landing the first American troops in North Africa. Of course, the first real American combat's going to be at Kasserine Pass, and it's going to be an absolute disaster. The U.S. is going to fire Friedenhall, who just was not up to the task, and they're going to bring in Patton, who's going to get them into shape, and within a couple of weeks is able to turn things around.
There's another tune the Nazis play about the British Empire.
The British are sitting back, letting others fight the war for them.
Ooh, we know that tune very well. Britain will fight to the last Australian or Canadian or New Zealander. The truth that thousands of Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders have gallantly fought and gallantly died in Crete, in Greece, in Libya. But there's something the Nazi mouthpiece leaves out, something pretty important. Out of every 10 inhabitants of the British Empire, 1 comes from Britain. But of the casualties suffered so far in this war, 7 out of 10 were born and raised in Britain.
There you go.
1 of 10 in population, 7 of 10 in casualties.
So I like this. It's a mix of appealing to the heart, but also appealing to the head. Here are the actual statistics. Here's the facts that refute what you're being told by the Germans.
In the air, of the planes flying with the RAF in Britain, 2 out of 3 are manned by crews from the island. And of the planes on the overseas fronts, the Western Desert in Africa and the West, 4 out of 5 are manned by boys from Britain. And then there's a little thing called the British Navy.
Little thing.
From 1588, when it licked the Spanish Armada, to 1940, when we got moving on a 2-ocean navy, the greatest battle fleet in the world. That, too, is manned almost entirely by men of Britain. The little island in the Atlantic.
There's the king.
An island of seafarers. And the British Merchant Navy, still the greatest merchant navy in the world, in spite of all that Hitler can do. Men from every British town and village in the stokeholds of 10,000 ships.
So he says, despite what Hitler can do, because, I mean, there were literally thousands and thousands of ships that were sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic. I mean, just do something sometime. Take some time on your own. Go to Google. Just look up the number of ships that were sunk by U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic. Not strictly U-boats, also some of the cruisers and things like that were sent out there. It's ridiculous, and it shows you how much shipping was going across the Atlantic from the United States and going back and forth just because of how much got sunk.
On ice-coated decks,
in grimy engine rooms, men who have been torpedoed twice, 3 times.
My understanding is this was directed by Frank Capra, the same guy who did It's a Wonderful Life. So that's pretty cool.
There's one English sailor who's been torpedoed 6 times and still signed on again.
6 times.
But we never hear
Well, doesn't
about
that say a lot about the heart of the Englishman right there? Torpedoed 6 times, but still volunteered to keep doing it.
these things because of a curious character whose ways will never be completely understandable to an American. John Britton himself. He has an idea he shouldn't talk about himself and what he does. He calls it bad form. We call it damn silly. He'd say of a Spitfire, "Oh, she's not bad, little kite."
Oh, the Spitfire. Oh, love the Spitfire. If you're new to the channel, maybe you've never heard me mention, if and when this channel ever grows to 1 million subscribers, and I think someday we'll get there, I've already planned out that my gift to myself to celebrate that, and I'm going to invite all of you to come and take part and watch it. We're going to film it all, is a ride in a Spitfire. It's like 3,000 pounds for a half-hour ride in a Spitfire. You can go to Duxford and a couple other places in the UK and do that. That is my goal, is to take a ride in a Spitfire to celebrate 1 million subs.
But this man, the boss of the German Air Force, can tell
Goering.
us that the Spitfire has been the most deadly fighter in the world.
Goering himself was in the German Air Force during the First World War. He actually he didn't immediately succeed Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, in command of his squadron, but he eventually came to command of the same squadron that Richthofen had commanded.
Certainly need an interpreter when this happens.
Hello, Bob. Had a good trip? Oh, all right.
All right. Except that he spent 2 days in the icy waters of the North Atlantic after being torpedoed on the way to Murmansk. See this man? His name is Whitten Brown. And this man, believe it or not, is the first man who flew the Atlantic non-stop. In 1919, 8 years before anyone else, he and John Alcock flew non-stop from Newfoundland to Ireland. But as usual, the British let it go at that.
Well, everybody talks about Charles Lindbergh. He was the first to do the solo flight across the Atlantic by himself, because it takes like over a day to do that. So in this case, there were 2 of them.
And Whitten Brown went back into obscurity. There's nothing wrong with John Britton that a correspondence course in showmanship wouldn't cure.
They're saying, listen, Brits, you need to learn how to show off a little bit, how to brag a little bit. And that's part of why one of the things that the British didn't like about the Americans when they came over was how brash and showy and kind of full of themselves they appeared to be, because that was very counter to the British perspective.
For a moment, imagine that you're not American, but British. You'd still be in uniform. For in Britain, every man between the age of 18 and 41, unless he cannot be replaced at a vital workbench, is already in uniform. Your old man, too. He's had to quit guessing about the last war, for they're now starting to draft men up to 51.
Wow.
Dependents or no dependents. If you've got yourself into this mess, your draft board will say, "Frightfully sorry, old chap, but you're in the Army anyway." And your kid sister, if she isn't a sailor, or in the Air Force, or the Land Army, or a ferry pilot, or in the Fire Brigade, she's probably in the Army. For they've drafted unmarried women up to 30.
First 9,000!
And even if she's married, every woman up to 41 can be drafted to work in war plants. And it's a real draft. For 8 million workers, men and women, can't quit their jobs or be fired without government permission. Britain is only 20 miles from German guns and German planes. Everybody, man or woman, young or old, is in the front line.
That's the thing that I think for Americans, was difficult to grasp was just how on the front lines the British were in all of this. Not only under constant bombardment early in the war, but 20 miles separate England and France at their closest point. And France was under German occupation at that point. That's how close it was. For the Americans, it was thousands of miles.
Maybe this isn't your idea of Britain. The ads were different, and you wondered whether they still made bows and arrows at the village forge. The ads kept quiet about industry, just as this one leaves out the aircraft plants and the oil fields.
I just love those little tidbits, like, hey, here we're going to show you a bunch of stuff. This is what you thought of Britain. Oh, by the way, we do the same kind of thing when we're talking about Southern California, So it's all about, they're a lot more like us than we realize. And even the things that are different, it's okay that they're different.
Well, they have the rich green fields you've read about, the quiet country lanes, but they also have the steel mills of Sheffield, the Pittsburgh of Britain.
The Pittsburgh of Britain.
They have the picturesque little villages, the gently flowing streams, the lovely old castles, but they also have the shipyards of the River Clyde. Not
Scotland.
As modern as Henry Kaiser's, but still one of the greatest in the world. They have
Glasgow.
the old cathedrals, deathless reminders of a rich tradition. But they also have the great industrial cities of Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester, Leeds. They seldom, if ever, saw an American tourist, but they made Britain, even in peacetime, one of the greatest industrial powers in the world.
Yeah, listen, the Industrial Revolution started in the West Midlands of England. It started in Birmingham. That's where, so much of industry started. That's where, steam engines really were first used in significant ways. That's where plastic was invented. There's so much that went on there.
And in wartime, even as late as July 1942, this little island, no larger than the state of Idaho, was making more war goods than we were. Maybe you thought John Britain sat there and waited for us to send him planes and guns and tanks. Well, he's deeply grateful for what our Lend-Lease did for him. It saved his skin when he was in a tough spot. But today, Lend-Lease works in more ways than one. For today, John Britain himself furnishes planes and guns and tanks through the same Lend-Lease to us, to Russia, and his other allies all over the world. In Britain alone, our forces have received, free from the British, 1.5 million tons of food, clothing, and munitions, and 2.5 million tons of other materials. There's another thing you ought to know about Britain. If your unit gets sent there, you probably won't be invited out for supper or for a drink. That's not because the British don't want to entertain you. They haven't anything to entertain you with. Britain is mobilized for war.
Right.
Total war. And that means an end to civilian supplies.
Yeah, listen, it's not that we're not glad you're here, but we're focused on the mission. That's why we're not worried about those things. But still, I mean, the Americans, there was a lot of experiencing the pub life and the city life and all of those sorts of things.
If you were a Britisher, you wouldn't expect your girl to use lipstick. There isn't any, except what we bring over as bait.
As bait. Wow. And people forget, and I don't know when it ended in the United States, but for years after the Second World War, the British were still under rationing.
She wouldn't be smartly dressed, for clothes are rationed, severely rationed. It's very unlikely she wears stockings, for if she bought a pair of stockings a month, that would be all the clothes of any kind she could buy. That's some rationing. We think our gas rationing is tough, but John Britain gets no gas at all. He goes to a pub to buy a bottle of whiskey. The pub keeper laughs in his face. Grain is needed for industrial alcohol. Industrial alcohol is needed for munitions. And nearly all the reserve stock of British whiskey is kept for sale to America to pay for the goods Britain buys here. For don't forget, Besides Lend-Lease, Britain buys and pays for vast quantities of goods. And it was the cash purchases that Britain made before we entered the war that gave our munitions industry its start and enabled us to build it up in record time. He goes to buy a pack of cigarettes. There probably aren't any. But if there are,
2 shillings, please.
that's 40 cents for a pack of cigarettes. 12 cents represent the cost of the cigarettes. The other 28, the tax paid to the government. For Britain is going all out in taxation. Nobody is making any money out of this war. Industry is paying. Excess profits tax is 100%.
Wow.
Labor is paying. The man who earns $33 a week pays 29% income tax.
That's the low.
And the rich man, if there are any of them left, pays an income tax of no less than 97.5%. And then there's the little matter of food. There are not many fat men in England nowadays. But John Britton isn't kicking. He knows 1 egg a week is helping him to win the war. The British rations are the rations of a free people. They could get food as they did in peacetime from Canada, Australia. But that would take ships. And the British prefer to use the ships for supplies to Russia, planes from America, troops to the Mediterranean. To win the war, every Britisher is on short rations.
And it wasn't just the British who did this, but this is a great insight into the home front during the war for all of these nations. It was hard. Yes, everybody was in this together. This was not, for our generation, we've been through wars like in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it didn't affect our daily life unless you had a friend or family member who was over there. It didn't affect your daily life. There was no change to what you could buy or what you could eat. It really just life continued as normal here. But that was impossible during the Second World War. Everyone was affected.
And has been on short rations for 2 years. Everybody except the children. They get 4 times the eggs that grown-ups do. They get all the oranges that arrive in Britain. And practically all of the extra milk.
Wow.
For John Britton is thinking of after the war. Of the new world that his children and ours will inherit.
I love that. I love that they're thinking of the kids. Okay, we're going to make sure the kids have what they need because we are going to win this and there is going to be a peace. And you have to have that, right? When you're fighting a war, especially a war that goes on for 6 years and costs millions of lives, you need some hope somewhere. You need something to look forward to.
A world where there will not only be freedom of speech and freedom of worship, but also freedom from want and freedom from fear.
I think that comes directly from a speech given by Roosevelt.
It's not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, work together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
This is what the British are fighting for. They are an old people, a stubborn people, and sometimes they have moved slowly. But in 3 years of blood and sweat and tears, John Britton has found his soul.
Handel's Messiah. If you go to Westminster Abbey in London, you'll find George Friedrich Handel's grave. He's right there in what they call Poets' Corner, where a lot of famous writers and musicians are buried.
Now he is tough. Now he is determined, and now he knows where he is marching, to victory and to a new world. He's a good man to have on our team.
V for victory. All right, that was good. I really enjoyed that. And my understanding is that there are some of you have been telling me about the ones like Know Your Enemy, like the Japanese or the Germans. So we'll definitely be taking a look at more of these because I think it's a fascinating way to look at history. It's a really cool lens through which to see it. So let me know your thoughts about what we talked about today, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.